Good morning, British and American culture class. This is our lecture at the tail end of our holiday, Chuseok holiday. I hope you enjoyed yourself. It's time to get back into our regular routine. Everybody should have a book now. No excuse for that. I know the distribution by the websites was pretty poor, but now I'm going to ask that after you listen to my lecture, you review what I've said and add a little bit of depth to what I'm explaining by reading the textbook. So, we are going to move into the 16th century, which is works out to be about 500 years ago. And this is the point where things, I think, will start to become more familiar to you, just in the sense that it's called the early modern period for a reason. It's the time in England where we start to see the institutions and the perspectives and the lifestyle that becomes recognizably modern, like the way that we live. We're technically postmodern, I suppose, being the 21st century, but even those of you who are only 20 years old, which there are many of you, you will probably start to recognize features of the culture that are recognizably modern, and that's where the name comes from. The period is also called the the Elizabethan Age because of Queen Elizabeth, because she had such a profound influence on the shaping of the English state and subsequently the British state that would follow. It's also called the English Renaissance because there was an Italian Renaissance several hundred years earlier, but there was, for various reasons, a delay in the incorporation of that knowledge and the relearning of classical culture in England. The culture of the British is going to rapidly catch up, though, over the next couple lectures. I want to point out that basically at the beginning of this lecture, in the time frame we're talking about, that England is it's relegated to like a very marginal role in European affairs, and France becomes increasingly, as it's always been, central to the path that Europe takes, and the Holy Roman Empire, which is for most of us, that would just mean Germany and Austria essentially today, as the core states that influence the path of European politics and European society. What some of the kings and queens want is they want to play a bigger role, which they've lost. And this is where we're going to start the lecture today, is that in 1453, at the end of the period, we're talking about the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt and the development of English in Chaucer's writing, and the influence of John Wycliffe. We talked about this last lecture, with his printing of an English version of the Bible and his emphasis on Protestant, I mean not Protestant, but what will become Protestant values, his influence on the type of religious behavior that English people are doing, as opposed to the medieval style of everything revolving around religion, but taking a step back and trying to interpret the meaning of the Bible and God's message themselves, taking the religious aspect of their life and sort of possessing it and adding an individual element instead of waiting for the priest to explain everything and to have this distance between yourself and the fundamental elements of the religion. Wycliffe was essentially enabling every person to participate more actively in the understanding of what the religious, how to understand the Bible and how to understand proper behavior. This is a fundamental change in the culture, and I think it's not necessarily true. I hate to use stereotypes, but there is this constant reference to an Asian culture that is more collective and a Western culture that is more individualistic. I'm sure you've all heard it from somewhere at some point, even though you haven't been studying that long yet. But people always make these broad observations about Asian culture versus Western culture, what we call Western culture, and it's not really Eastern or Western necessarily, considering all the developments in our technology and map making ability. But regardless, people make these observations and have these understandings of these fundamental differences in culture. And sometimes these are more like, I would say, more like a trend that develops. And certainly English culture would rather, the kings and I think the fundamental difference is there because there wasn't that ability to control the whole society and have everybody follow the rules the way that Confucian philosophy or like an emperor or a Chinese bureaucracy might be able to control the population. This didn't happen. And as a consequence, this conflict of ideas, this mixing of perspectives from people that aren't necessarily born into the upper ranks or don't have access to the upper ranks of society, does create this impulse for individualism. And we're going to have to talk about what goes into that. There's a lot of factors: education, financial issues. There's all kinds of things that enable people in the British Isles to have more agency and to express themselves and for their ideas to be shared. Literacy has a lot to do with this. The literacy rates in England and Scotland start to climb during this period, and more people are reading, and so their perspectives expand, and thus they decide that they don't need to be told what to do by other people. And all of this goes into what appears to be a trend in a different direction, an individualistic trend in especially England, in the northern European states, whereas, for example, in East Asia, the trend doesn't develop until later. So I'm not trying to say that in a general sense, Asians are less likely to develop individualism, because I think that's not true. But certainly 400 or 500 years ago, just by comparison, you can see that what is going to become a general attitude towards defending independence and individualism comes from this culture, this English culture, which will be transferred across the Atlantic Ocean to America. And you can see right now how this can be a negative thing as well, that people insist that they need to behave in their own way and not follow the rules. The coronavirus is a great example of how certain countries seem to have, because of leadership and because of their attitude towards their listening to authority, whether it's their own choice of leader or not, that they choose to make their own decision, which is not always the right decision. This can backfire spectacularly. If the leader tells you to do something and you all follow the leader and the leader is wrong, this can have catastrophic results. So let's start to build a picture of what the 16th century is like. This is the period that I've studied the most through my academic career. So I feel most comfortable talking about these things in detail because of my familiarity with Renaissance writing 16th century literature, Shakespeare and all the rest. This is part of my academic background. So I'm going to try not to go too deeply into it because we don't have time for that, and we're supposed to cover the whole length and breadth of British culture. But certainly, if you have questions about something that I have said in lecture, please do contact me and email me your questions, and I will try to respond to them to the entire class, because there tends to be more questions asked about this section than any other ones, probably because I become sort of focused on the ideas that are developing in British culture. So it becomes a little bit more complicated. So please ask your questions by email, and I will attempt to clarify anything that isn't clear from the lecture. You have until Tuesday. Because this is a holiday, I extended the period for you to study and watch this video lecture. This is going to be uploaded on Saturday morning, so it still gives you 3 or 4 days to watch and get credit for your cyber lecture. So here we go. 1453 is a very important date in European history. Firstly, because in the East, what we refer to as, the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, the capital of Turkey, it finally, after hundreds of years of being surrounded by hostile people and armies, finally is taken over, conquered by the Turks. And this lays the foundation for the Ottoman Empire, which is sort of, in a sense, an intrusion into Europe in terms of its religion and its cultural background. Turkish people are originally from Central Asia, so it's kind of an invading culture, if you will, on the edge of, Christian Europe. And they do threaten. They come all the way to Vienna and threaten the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Holy Roman Empire at a later point. So this sets the foundation for the development of the Ottoman Empire, and this threat, which various European states will deal with over the next several hundred years. At the same time that occurs, the French finally expel the English from northern France, and Normandy and Anjou and Aquitaine and all the territory that Poitou, all of these parts of France that were under the control of the English, finally are absorbed into the French state. You probably all know the story about Joan d'Arc. This is earlier in the century. She prevents the English from completely taking over France by defending Orleans. She's long dead by this point. She's burned at the stake as a witch. But the King of England is a very weak king, Henry VI. We're going to very shortly talk about the most famous Henry VIII, as coincidentally the last Henry who becomes a king. And it's not likely that we're going to have another one, because Harry is third in line. He's not third in line. I guess he's fifth or sixth in line for the crown now. So Harry is a playful nickname for somebody who's named Henry. So we're going to talk about Henry VIII in a minute. But basically, Henry VI is a weak king. He's not mentally all there. And England starts to fall apart because his leadership is so weak. And various people start trying to control him and control England itself. This is the background for something called the War of the Roses, which goes on for more than a generation, about 30 years or so, from 1453 till nearly the end of the 15th century, there's various kings and queens and factions and wealthy dukes and earls who are competing for control of the king or to be the king or queen themselves. This is the setting and the origin of the idea for Game of Thrones, the famous HBO, the famous HBO series, fantasy series on TV. There's also a series of books. I have it right here. This is George R.R. Martin's series. That's it. Game of Thrones. He has told us, sorry, that's the third book. This is the first book. There we go. I have the first three books there. They're gigantic. But the whole story in Game of Thrones is based on the War of the Roses. That's the inspiration for this fantasy series, which was immensely popular. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to get this back in there. If you haven't seen it, it's really worth watching. It's a fantastic story, and it's based on real life. So this conflict rips England apart for 30 years or so, an entire generation of people. And by the time it's over, and a man named another Henry VII becomes the king. He's called Henry Tudor because this is his ancestry. It's the House of Richmond ends up on top at the end. Henry VII consolidates the country and stabilizes everything. He's very, in some ways, not heroic king, but very reasonable and intelligent and politically savvy. So he settles everything down, and he makes these alliances between Spain and France and connections between, and he doesn't start any new wars, and everything calms down, and England starts to reassert itself as like a legitimate European power. For the better part of the 15th century, they lose territory, except for a brief resurgence by Henry V, who is a heroic king who fights the French and briefly almost unifies the French and the English crown. Except for that, the 15th century is a terrible series of accidents and tragedies for the development of England. So things go very badly. And he kind of stabilizes everything, rights the ship, and then he dies. He sets everything up, though, for his children. His first son is named Arthur. We talked about King Arthur. That's a very obvious choice of names because he wants his son to be King Arthur and reascend. And he actually is Welsh, part Welsh. So it all comes together very nicely because the Welsh are the descendants of the Britons, who are, the Romano-Britons and the Celtic culture in the west of England. And so there's actually a genetic connection and a cultural connection and everything. And so he names his first son Arthur, but and his son Arthur marries a Spanish princess, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen who sent Columbus to the New World. This is all like spectacularly arranged. Like he's a political genius, this Henry VII. And then after they get married, Arthur dies, which ruins everything essentially. And then Henry VII himself dies. So everything he's carefully prepared kind of is thrown out the window suddenly. But he has another son. His second son is named Henry as well. And Henry saves the day by not dying and by marrying Catherine, Princess Catherine, now Queen Catherine of Aragon from Spain. And he marries his brother's widow. She's older than him by almost 10 years, but this is too important to have this connection between Spain and England. So he marries her and he becomes Henry VIII. And this is the Henry that everybody knows. This is the monster, the hero, the monster, the intelligent, the forceful and powerful king who has a very complicated relationship with everybody. His wives, his government officials, his people, his religion, himself. It's just, I don't know how to describe him. He's a fascinating person, and not necessarily in a good way. So anyway, Henry decides to marry his brother's wife, former wife, and after his brother and father both die. And so he becomes Henry VIII, and he wants very desperately to have children, especially a son. When he's young, he's tall, he's handsome, he's athletic, he's very intelligent. He reads and writes and speaks in 4 or 5 languages: Greek, Latin, French, English, Spanish. The guy is just extremely talented, and all of the Tudor rulers, no matter how badly or how well or how badly they rule the country, they're all extremely talented, especially well-educated and intelligent, linguistically and in general. He plays sports, he hunts, he's tall and handsome, and so everybody expects the best out of him. And he has a hunting accident when he's young, which he breaks his leg, and forever after he's not in good health. He can't ride and walk or exercise properly. So having the diet of a king, he gains weight and becomes bigger and bigger and less healthy. That's one of the reasons probably that he's in very poor health in his later life. But he's an egomaniac. Henry definitely is obsessed with himself. He's a narcissistic, selfish egoist, and everything in the world revolves around him. He is the king after all, so you can understand why he might think this. But everything actually does revolve around him. And when he gets upset, angry, disappointed, frustrated, he often kills people, even if he's married to them. So as he gets older, he manages to have a daughter with Catherine, and her name is Mary, and she grows up first, and all the other children are either the pregnancy doesn't go well and they lose the baby, or several times a boy is born, but several weeks later the boy dies. The baby boy dies, which is fairly common in this period. So this is the story of Henry VIII. It's a pretty tragic story. And he, as a consequence of this disappointment, not that he necessarily blames Catherine for it, but once she gets closer to 40, she's not going to be able to have children anymore. So he has a problem because he needs a son to be the next king. But his wife is not able to have another child, clearly. And he starts to have a conflict over that problem. It's referred to usually as the king's great matter. This is just an expression to cover up what is really a very scary thing for all of England, for the Queen, for the relationship with Spain, for anybody who's trying to support the king. He just desperately wants this one thing, and it's not an easy thing to get him. He ends up deciding that he needs a divorce. But of course, his relatives in Spain, and the Pope, and the powerful people in Europe don't want to give him this because Queen Catherine is the daughter of the Spanish king and related to the Holy Roman Emperor as well. and they do not want her to be replaced. He could have just done what many other kings do and had a girlfriend or arranged something, but he didn't want that. He wanted a new wife, and he wanted to have a legitimate heir. So this creates all kinds of international friction just because of the king's stubbornness, essentially. But he starts to believe, although he's a Catholic, he starts to believe that the only way to deal with this problem is to get a divorce from the Catholic Church, which they refuse. And because of his personality and his confidence in himself, he decides that in that case, he's going to cut the connection between the English Church and the Catholic Church and create his own church where he's essentially the Pope of the Church of England. And this is what is called the Reformation. Now, this is going to take an entire other lecture to talk about. So I'm just mentioning this is in 1534. Don't worry about the date so much as just the order of events. But he looks for a divorce for several years, and it's not approved. So he officially makes himself the leader of the English Church. So he unifies religion and politics in himself. And this is why he's able to do essentially whatever he wants in his middle age, because he is the leader of the church and the leader of the state. There is quite strict laws and social. We always try and separate religion and state in Western politics and countries because of this danger of having supreme power in both areas unified in one person. It becomes very difficult to stop any reckless or authoritarian behavior when the person is the spiritual leader and the political leader of the state. So, but he manages to do this. So, of course, when he does this, the first thing he does is run around England and close down all of the Catholic institutions like monasteries and churches, and he collects the wealth, because at the same time as Henry has all these personal problems and romantic problems and political problems, he also has a desire to go back to France and take back the land that belonged to his ancestors. So this is very expensive behavior, starting wars and breaking alliances and spending on his own personal interests, building castles or supporting banquets and expensive events. And so he regularly goes to France to fight different opponents in order to try and retake the pieces of France that used to belong to the King of England. And he fails. But these are incredibly expensive actions, and one of the ways that he is able to pay for it is by possessing the wealth of the church, taking the land and the material wealth of the church and spending it on his own plans. So although he becomes extremely wealthy from taking the wealth of the church, the riches of the Catholic Church, he ends up spending it all, and by the time he dies, there's nothing left. So long story short, it really doesn't appear to be a religious decision at all, unlike Martin Luther King and John Wycliffe, who were ideologically different than Catholics. The Reformation, as it appears during King Henry VIII's reign, it doesn't really change the way that religion is practiced during his lifetime, because Henry is basically a committed Catholic. His only problem really is he doesn't want to listen to the Pope. He still likes the Catholic Church. He likes the ceremonies. He likes the beauty of the Catholic Church. He likes the He likes the Latin elements of it. He's not concerned about the way that the religion is practiced. He just doesn't want other people to tell him what to do, especially people from Italy, in particular the Pope. He doesn't want to ask anybody for approval or permission to do anything. So he cuts that connection, but he kind of keeps the Anglican Church. The Church of England maintains its appearance of being Catholic until he dies. And he still lights candles, he still prays, and he still observes the holidays and the saints and all those other activities that would be proper Catholic behavior, because that's what he believes. However, when he dies, his son, and again, we're going to have to delay the discussion of the Reformation and the Henry VIII's children until next lecture, so you get a better picture of what's going on. But there's going to be a swing towards Protestant belief. And in the textbook, just so you can be properly prepared for this, the first part of the chapter that we're dealing with, chapter 3, is largely a discussion of the religious aspect. Halfway through the chapter, I start talking about the Tudors. But Henry VIII is so important in a cultural sense and an individual impact that his story had to be explained, I think, in detail for us to really understand how things are going to go from now on. Basically, everything that happens in the next 200 years in this story of the development of British and American culture is a product of Henry VIII's behavior. It's not very often that one individual, there's different theories of cultural, development and historical development, and there's this great man theory, that is opposed to what we call like a trends and forces theory, where broad trends and behaviors are going to happen no matter who is there. Like everybody is just sort of a role player. And inevitably, the culture is going to change, whether it's Henry VIII or Napoleon or Julius Caesar, doesn't matter. But then there's another opposing theory, which was very popular in the past, that states that if without this particular person's unique behaviors and personality and abilities, these things would never have happened, right? I prefer to look at it as like a combination of both, because that's more reasonable, I think. It's not just Henry VIII that causes this transformation in English society. Of course not. Wycliffe already had spread these ideas. They were already in English society. So just the thing that triggered this disconnection from Catholicism and started England down this road towards what we call Protestant, separation from the Catholic Church, from the Universal Church of Europe, which we now call Roman Catholicism. What made this cultural moment occur was the individual characteristics of Henry VIII. So you can really look back and say, yes, a different king wouldn't have pushed it in that direction, but this king, there was no stopping his commitment to his own agenda. So this sort of in his own lifetime didn't cause a huge transformation in English religious life or culture, but down the road, this is going to cause huge problems between different parts of English society, and eventually it's going to transform England into this more individualistic, more relaxed version of this more distant version of more individualistic and distant version of religious behavior. And now we have, a state called the United States of America, where people tend to be more religious. And we have another state, the original home, the foundation and the base of all of this culture in England, where very few people attend church and very few people are dedicated to religious belief or practice or ceremonies or church attendance. Whereas, in America, there still is higher attendance rate and a deeper belief in religious spiritual life. But now it's really diminished to the point that it's not a significant factor in the United Kingdom anymore. So it's an interesting story, and we're going to have to come back to this. Next lecture will be, what is the Reformation? What are the core beliefs of Catholic and Protestant Christian faiths? And I will tell you about that. In the textbook, we're going to be discussing, it's page 90 going through to page 100. Page 90 to page 100. If you want to read before we do the lecture, then go ahead, because this is basically all of the ideas I'm going to discuss are there in the textbook. Or you can, of course, wait until Monday. It's only a couple days away when I do my lecture, and then you can read up on the details after I speak about it. So we are here in our progress. We have another quiz. The quiz is going to be a week from Monday. Not this Monday, I promised. Give us a break. Chuseok is just finished. Everybody's still relaxed. I know I don't want to surprise you, blindside you with a quiz. A week from Monday. Okay, what are we at now? October 2nd? So it's I think we're talking about the 10th, maybe? Or the 12th might be the right date. Not to make you concerned about it, just letting you know that we have one more quiz before the midterm. And the content of it is, of course, going to be this. Henry VIII, the Reformation, the creation of the beginnings of the British Empire, the conflict with Spain, and of course, everybody's favorite, William Shakespeare and his brothers and sisters who start the literary renaissance in England. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening. I know some of these lectures get fairly long when we're getting close to 35 or 40 minutes, but there is a lot to learn. So like I said, please send me an email if you have any questions, and I will respond to the email en masse, through the video lecture, and so everybody can hear the answer to your question. So enjoy the rest of the long weekend, and I will see you on Monday. Take care.